The AM4 socket just won't seem to die. Its successor, AM5, is about to turn 2 years old and is already on its second generation of CPUs, and yet the now 8-year-old platform is still enjoying new CPU releases, mostly focused on the lower price range. As a result, we have this, the Ryzen 7 5700X3D, an AM4 chip with 3D V-cache released in 2024 that comes in at a massive price cut compared to its brethren. With Ryzen 9000 receiving less than glowing reviews, perhaps this budget 8-core with a massive 96MB of L3 cache will give you another good reason to hold off upgrading your old motherboard for a little while longer. X3D series CPUs were originally targeted at gamers with higher budgets, those whose RTX 4090s are screaming out for a CPU that can keep up. In the process of keeping the AM4 socket alive, AMD have brought 3D V-cache down to a price point that more gamers can afford. The Ryzen 7 5700X3D is currently the cheapest universally available CPU in the series, with an MSRP of $249 and a retail price for under $200. Oh, sure, they say there's a 6-core model that's even better value, but you wouldn't have met her, she goes to another school. Like all CPUs that use 3D V-cache, AMD limits the clock speeds on the 5700X3D to avoid cooking the extra memory chips, which are stacked right on top of the CPU die. This means there's little to no room for overclocking or any performance to be gained through precision boost overdrive. This chip has a turbo clock of 4.1 GHz, and you're not likely to see it go any higher than that. Meanwhile, the regular Ryzen 7 5700X, the version without 3D V-cache, can be had for $40 to $50 less than the X3D. While it has just the regular 32MB of L3 cache you'd find on most other Ryzens, it has the advantage of higher boost speeds and PBO. Not every game and application benefits from the extra cache, so in some cases, the cheaper AM4 CPU could actually find itself on top. On the opposite side, the $200 asking price is starting to enter the price range of entry-level AM5 CPUs. The Ryzen 5 7500F is one of the cheapest SKUs on the market at the moment, potentially cheaper than the 5700X3D, though the AM5 motherboards and DDR5 RAM are usually more expensive. It only has 6 cores and the same boring old 2D cache of the 5700X, but it has architectural improvements and faster memory to work with. While the 5700X3D might be a compelling reason to stick with AM4, the 7500F is one of the better reasons to consider a platform upgrade. To see if the 5700X3D can justify its existence, I've paired it with 32GB of DDR4 clocked at 3600 CL16 and a Radeon RX 7900 XT, and for comparison I've refreshed my Ryzen 7 5700X and Ryzen 5 7500F results with the new graphics card. On that note, the 5700X results are a little lower than my previous test a few months ago, and I'm not 100% certain why. I checked my PBO settings and RAM timings and confirmed SAM was enabled. The only variable, other than the more powerful GPU, is the motherboard. So perhaps the Asus TUF board I used last time was holding clock speeds higher than my Gigabyte is now. Historically, Valorant has proven to have a preference for clock speeds and L3 cache rather than threads. The two 5700Xs cancel each other out in that regard, with the average over 3 matches coming to 476 on the 3D V-cache enabled model and 484 on the regular version. The 7500F, meanwhile, shows that the architecture can make a difference too, scoring an average of 590 FPS over 3 matches. Granted, there can be some differences in performance between maps, but Ryzen 7000 consistently produces frame rates in the 600 and 700 range in Valorant, while Ryzen 5000 rarely exceeds the low 500s. As if that's not enough FPS. There's a more measurable difference between the two Zen 3 CPUs in Counter-Strike 2. Apparently, the more recent engine has a preference for the X3D model, with the average FPS of 289 being more than 10% higher than the 5700X at the same settings. That being said, the last time I tested the 5700X back on the Asus motherboard, it scored over 300 FPS, so perhaps there's more to be squeezed out of the regular model. Either way, these 5000 series chips are still about 20% short of the cheapest Ryzen 7000 series, as the 7500F can reach 340 FPS. I finally got to confirm a theory of mine about Warzone. At some point in the last 6 months or so, performance has improved in CPU-limited situations. The last 5700X benchmark I ran came in at just 138 FPS, whereas now it manages over 170, though lows are about the same. The X3D fares even better, scoring over 190 FPS with over 101% lows. As good as this is, it's still 15% behind the Ryzen 5 7500F. I've added Space Marine 2 as a brand new entry to my benchmarking roster, because I heard it can be pretty hard on the CPU. Although this test setup can drive well over 100 FPS at 1080p Ultra with FSR performance, during battles there are scenes with huge numbers of Tyranid enemies attacking in swarms, which really hammers the CPU. The scene I've chosen to benchmark is one such attack, and the 5700X3D sees an average of 90 FPS. Meanwhile, the non-3D version is slower, but not by as much as you might expect. The cheaper chip can still drive 84 FPS under the same conditions. Moving up to Zen 4 has a far bigger impact, raising averages to over 100 FPS and lows to over 90. Starfield can be a hard game for a CPU to drive, especially if you're hoping to break past 100 FPS in the city areas. So far, and bear in mind I've only tested a relatively small number of modern CPUs, the only ones that have achieved that very specific target have been the Ryzen 9 7900X3D and the i9 12900KS. Well, chalk up another entry to the list. The 5700X3D can push nearly 104 FPS on average, almost 20% faster than the non-3D version. That one meanwhile manages a more pedestrian sub-90 average and remains above 60 most of the time. Perfectly playable and acceptable, but about 15% slower than the X3D. For the first time in this video, the 7500F takes second place, with the 3D V-cache really showing its worth in this one. Cyberpunk 2077 is another game that seems to really love 3D chips. If I drop to the medium preset, putting as much load onto the CPU as possible, the 5700X3D can almost hit 160 FPS, making it one of the fastest chips I've ever tested. The 7500F is actually a handful of frames behind, though the difference should be barely noticeable, and the regular 5700X is about 20% behind that. With ultra ray tracing enabled, and a ton of FSR to offset the increased GPU load, the X3D drops to just under 90 FPS. The 5700X remains 20% adrift at the bottom, but the 7500F squeezes into first place by a small margin. Again, not that noticeable overall, but the higher 1% lows of the AM4 CPU should be worth it. When I retested the non-3D 5700X for this video, I was disappointed to see that The Last of Us had suffered a pretty significant performance drop. This is possibly down to the different motherboard, but whatever the reason, it's dropped from almost 130 FPS to 115. Meanwhile, the 5700X3D is still maintaining over 130 in this setup, which is admirable, but still over 10% behind the 7500F. Dragon's Dogma 2's had several patches since release, and I don't know what effect they were supposed to have, but from what I've seen, things seem to be about as bad as ever. In my short benchmarking run around the city, there are still a few stutters here and there on both the 8 cores, and while the 5700X 3D manages a solid 78 average, 1% lows are in the 40s, and 0.1s are below 30 FPS. The 5700X is almost 20% worse on average, but about the same in terms of frame pacing. However, the 7500F falls apart. The numbers look pretty good, because they're from my 5th run, after rebooting the system because the first 3 were so bad. The 4th run was still stuttery as all hell, so I have to assume that the rest of the game will be like that too. It just seems like 6 cores don't really have a chance here. It's not all doom and gloom, however. Jedi Survivor just had a patch that removed de novo. The result isn't flawless, but the improvement is dramatic. The 7500F now gives a silky smooth 160 FPS average, with 1% lows in the 90s. I've never seen this game run this well before. Meanwhile, the 5700X 3D scores a very healthy 146 FPS on average, with 1% lows of 75. Finally, the 5700X scored 110 FPS with 1% lows of 58 and 0.1s of 42. Moving over to synthetic benchmarks and productivity, things don't hold up quite so well for the 3D chip. In Cinebench R23, the 5700X 3D scores a little over 12,000 in the multi-core test, which is a good 2,000 points behind the non-3D version and 3,000 behind the 7500F. The single-core result is on par with an overclocked Coffee Lake chip from 5 years ago, and a long way behind the others in this test. In Geekbench, the non-3D 5700X loses out in multi-core, and the 7500F wins by almost 40%, despite its core deficit. As I don't really have much experience of the machine learning side of things, I don't know if the higher Geekbench ML score is worth it over the non-3D model, but given how much better the Ryzen 7000 chip is, I'd be surprised if this was much of a selling point. In 3D Mark, the Zen 3 results are quite surprising. As a DX12 test, Time Spy's win for the 5700X 3D versus the regular 5700X isn't such a shock, but the fairly small margin was unexpected. I kinda thought the X3D would run away with it. The 7500F loses this test by about 600 points. On the other hand, Firestrike hands the win to the newer 6-core, and even the non-3D chip beats the X3D by about 5%. The Blender results are pretty close between the AM4 chips, probably too close to call, at least purely on numbers, as the classroom render finishes less than 23 seconds faster on the 5700X than the X3D. On the positive side, the 3D chip is only drawing a maximum of 176 watts during this test, compared to the higher clocked 5700X at 193 watts and the 7500F at 185. In Davinci Resolve, meanwhile, the cheaper chip is only about 17 seconds faster than the 5700X 3D, while the 6-core Zen 4 CPU is a whole minute faster. Whether or not the 5700X 3D is worth buying depends on a few factors, not least of which is where you are in the world. At the time of writing this script, the 5700X 3D was selling for £182 brand new in the UK, next to $132 for the non-3D model. In the US, that's $196 and $158 respectively. The price difference of 24% in the US goes to 38% in the UK, and while a few pounds is not that much in the context of a whole new PC build, in terms of value for money it does change things somewhat. On the other hand, there's the whole reason why I was able to make this video in the first place. Sellers on AliExpress are currently selling apparently brand new OEM 5700X 3Ds for just £115 before tax, compared to £100 for the regular 5700X. if you have access to these prices and don't mind the risk associated with buying from AliExpress, this is a no-brainer for anyone who already owns an AM4 motherboard. But is it enough to make you forget about AM5? The Ryzen 9000 series might not have any budget options yet, and the Ryzen 8000 series might mostly suck, but it's possible to pick up the Ryzen 5 7500F from AliExpress for a similar price to the non-3D 5700X, and the 8-core Ryzen 7 7700 isn't much more expensive than the 5700X 3D itself. Avoiding AliExpress, the Ryzen 7600 is just the 7500F with integrated graphics, and it's also priced somewhere between the two AM4 CPUs. So, are any of them worth the cost of upgrading the whole platform? B550 motherboards start at £75 or about the same in dollars, and B650 starts at £85 or $100, so the socket upgrade doesn't have to be a huge expense. If you want Gen 5 PCI Express, they start at about $190, but if you have an eye on future GPUs and fast, expensive SSDs, then I think you should forget about AM4. DDR4 is cheap, but you still pay a premium for lower latencies, and a sweet spot kit of 3600 CL16 or below will set you back $65 or £75 for 32GB. The DDR5 sweet spot is around the 6000 CL30 mark, and that'll cost you about $90 or £100. In total, that means you could be paying as little as £35 or $50 more for the AM5 socket compared to AM4. And yeah, sure, that money could go towards your graphics card, or it could buy you a game. But it could also buy you a setup that could last you for your next 2 CPU upgrades. Maybe in your country the AM5 price situation is radically different and AM4 is the obvious choice, but for me, here in the UK, I don't think the 5700X3 is good enough to warrant it in 2024. There are still plenty of other scenarios in which the Ryzen 7 5700X 3D makes for a great purchase. Maybe you want to build a second PC using an old AM4 motherboard and some DDR4 you have lying around. Maybe you want to put together a cheap used gaming rig that can support an older high-end graphics card. Or maybe you picked up a previous gen Ryzen build for a song and want to get the best bang for buck upgrades. There are, however, plenty of non-gaming scenarios, and even a few gaming ones, where the 5700X is just as good, or even better. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.